The room that still knew their names, the hospital room, was quiet in the way only rooms at the edge of life ever are. Not silent, but softened, as if even sound itself had learned to walk carefully here. The afternoon light slid through half-drawn blinds in pale, tired stripes, touching the white sheets, the muted machines, the small vase of flowers that someone had replaced that morning. Outside, the city still moved, cars still passed. Voices still rose and fell somewhere far below. But inside this room, time felt different, stretched thin, almost transparent, as though every second could be the one that mattered most. Dean Martin lay against the pillows, thinner than the world remembered him, his breathing slow and measured, his face gentler now, sculpted less by laughter than by long, quiet endurance. The years had settled into him like dust on an old piano, not ruining it, only proving it had been played. He wasn't asleep. He rarely was these days. Sleep came in pieces, short and drifting, like radio signals that faded before the song could finish. Most of the time he lay awake, watching light shift, listening to the distant echo of carts in hallways, voices he didn't recognize, and sometimes, when the room was especially still, memories that felt louder than any sound. There were moments he thought he heard applause again, faint but warm, like heat left in brick after sunset. Other times he could almost hear laughter bouncing off studio walls, glasses clinking, orchestras tuning, the low murmur of crowds waiting for something reminder-worthy to happen. And sometimes he heard Frank's voice. Not imagined, not a memory replaying, but the emotional fingerprint of it. The way some people remain present even when they are not there. Dean's eyes were open when the door moved. He noticed things more now. Small things. The way hinges spoke. The way footsteps hesitated before entering. The way people inhaled before pretending they were stronger than they felt. The nurse appeared first, offering a soft smile, speaking his name gently, telling him he had a visitor. Dean did not ask who. Some part of him already knew. Another part of him had known for days. There are visits the body senses before the mind admits them. Frank Sinatra stepped into the room slowly, without entourage, without announcement, without the armor of performance that had followed him for most of his life. He wore a dark coat he hadn't worn on a stage, and his hat remained in his hands, fingers turning the brim the way they used to turn microphones, as if they were looking for something solid to hold. He had been in rooms like this before. Too many friends, musicians, men who once filled spaces with sound, and now filled them with absence. But this room was different. This was not a chapter closing. This was a book he had lived inside. For a moment, Frank did not move. He stood near the door, shoulders rising with a breath he did not quite control, eyes settling on the figure in the bed. Dean looked smaller than memory allowed, and somehow more himself than ever. The humor that had once danced so easily on his face now rested quietly there. Not gone, just no longer trying to entertain the world. His eyes lifted, and when they met Frank's, something invisible passed between them, something older than words, something that had been written in decades, not sentences. "Well," Dean said, his voice lighter than his body, carrying that familiar trace of warmth, "you always did know how to make an entrance." Frank let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it hadn't trembled halfway through. He crossed the room, slower than he would have liked, pulling a chair close to the bed. He didn't sit right away. He reached out first, resting his hand gently over Dean's. The skin fragile, the bones light beneath it, but the grip unmistakably real. "You look terrible," Frank said, and the words were old friends. Shaped by decades of insult that meant affection, Dean's mouth curved. "I always told you I'd go out of style one day." Frank sat then. And for a few seconds, neither spoke. They did not need to fill the air. They had filled enough rooms in their lives. This one did not require performance. This one required presence. The machines continued their quiet commentary. Light shifted again. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed too loudly, as if afraid of the silence. Frank watched Dean breathe. He hated that he noticed the spaces between breaths. He hated that part of him was counting without wanting to. He had sung about loss. He had made a career out of heartbreak. but nothing had prepared him for the sound of a friend's life moving so carefully. "How long are you staying?" Dean asked. "As long as you'll have me."
Out.
"Then don't waste it talking about the weather."
Ow.
Frank smiled at that. He had come with words. He always came with words. But now that he was here, they crowded behind his teeth, uncooperative, suddenly too small to carry what he felt. He had imagined speeches, confessions, stories. He had imagined thanking Dean for 1,000 nights, 1,000 stages, 1,000 moments when laughter had saved him from his own shadows. But sitting here, all he could feel was the weight of years pressing gently against his chest. They spoke. At first, of ordinary things. Of the way the city still pretended not to age. Of the music that no longer played the way it used to. Of friends whose names were now more often whispered than called. They talked about shows. About mistakes that still made them laugh. About a night in Vegas when the power went out and the crowd kept singing anyway. About a recording session where Dean had walked in late, glass in hand, and somehow still nailed the take, as if time had been waiting for him. But beneath every story was another conversation. One neither of them had started yet. Frank watched Dean's face as he talked. How memory moved through him like weather, sometimes bright, sometimes distant. He realized, with a heaviness that surprised him, that he had spent much of his life standing beside this man, but not often sitting quietly with him. They had shared stages, jokes, chaos, success, headlines, but silence was new. And silence, he was learning, was where the real things lived. "You know," Frank said finally, his voice lower now, "people think they know us." Dean's eyes flickered with humor. "They knew the suits. They knew the songs," Frank continued. "They knew the noise. They didn't know the mornings after. They didn't know the nights when nobody was watching."
Out.
Dean breathed out slowly. "That's all right. A man doesn't owe the whole world his inside." Frank nodded, but something in his chest tightened. He had spent his life letting the world hear him, letting them believe they knew him. And yet, sitting here, he felt suddenly aware of all the things he had never said to the one person who might have understood them without translation. There was a long pause. Dean's breathing grew slightly heavier, not strained, just more present. He shifted, and Frank instinctively leaned closer, ready to call someone. But Dean lifted his free hand slightly, a small gesture, asking him not to. "Frank," Dean said. The way he said his name was different. Not Stage Frank. Not Partner Frank. Just Frank. Yes. Dean turned his head a little, meeting his eyes more directly now. Whatever he was about to say was not for the room. It was not for memory. It was not for stories, it was for him. But before the words could come, the door opened quietly again. A nurse stepped in to check a reading, her presence gentle but grounding, the moment bending, not breaking, around her. Dean closed his eyes briefly, resting, saving something. Frank leaned back slightly, watching the rise and fall of his chest, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and urgency twist together inside him because he understood, suddenly and clearly, that this visit was not about goodbyes, it was about truths that had waited too long. And somewhere inside that thin, quiet space between one breath and the next, a whisper was forming that Frank Sinatra would carry for the rest of his life. The nurse finished her quiet routine and slipped from the room as gently as she had entered, leaving behind the soft mechanical breathing of the machines and the faraway hum of a world that had no idea what was unfolding in this small, closed space. Frank remained seated close to the bed, his body angled forward without realizing it, as though some instinct older than thought was trying to close the distance that time had created. Dean's eyes stayed shut for a long moment after the door closed, not in sleep, but in the careful, inward way of someone gathering themselves, as if he were reaching into a place that had not been opened in years, maybe decades, and needed to steady his hand before touching what was there. Frank watched him, feeling a strange tension build in the air. The kind that did not announce itself loudly, but pressed gently on the chest, subtle and insistent. Like the moment before a storm, when the sky has not yet changed color, but the birds already know. He had spent a lifetime reading rooms, reading crowds, reading orchestras and executives and audiences and men who wanted something from him. But this room refused to be read. This room was not asking him to perform. It was asking him to witness. Dean finally opened his eyes. They were clearer than they had been earlier, focused in a way Frank had not seen in some time. And for a fleeting second, Frank saw not the man in the bed, but the man who had once walked into chaos with a crooked smile and turned it into something human. Dean shifted slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, quieter, but more deliberate, as if each word had been chosen from a long line waiting behind his ribs. "You ever notice," Dean said, "how people remember the noise first?" Frank's mouth moved in a half-smile. "We made a lot of it." Dean nodded faintly. "Yeah, and it covered a lot too." Frank felt something tighten. He waited. "For years," Dean continued, his gaze drifting not to the ceiling but somewhere deeper, "I thought that was the job. Fill the room. Don't let it get too quiet. If people are laughing, they're not looking too close. If the music's loud enough, nobody hears what's underneath." Frank leaned back a fraction, not away from him, but into the weight of what was being said. He had always known Dean carried things. Everyone did. But there was something in the way he spoke now that suggested not just memory, but accounting. "They called us lucky," Dean said softly. "They called us kings. They called us everything that meant don't ask questions. And maybe we liked that. Maybe I liked that. It's easier to be a story than a person." Frank watched Dean's hand on the sheet, thin fingers resting where his own voice had once lived, where glasses had been raised, where microphones had been held, where gestures had once controlled rooms. He realized with a slow ache that he had rarely seen those hands still. "We were always moving," Frank said. "Always going somewhere." Dean's eyes returned to him. "Running somewhere," the word hung there. Frank inhaled, slow and controlled, but something in him had begun to unspool. He had come expecting nostalgia. He had not come expecting confession. Dean looked at him for a long moment before continuing, and when he did, his voice carried a subtle shift, as if he had stepped past the familiar edges of shared stories into territory that belonged only to him. "Do you remember the night in Chicago? The one nobody ever talks about?" Frank frowned faintly. "We had a lot of nights in Chicago." Dean's lips curved, but there was no humor in it. "Not that one." Frank searched his memory. There were lights, clubs, long sets, long drives, long laughs, but beneath them all, there were nights that never made it into the stories because they did not belong to the image. "I remember rain," Frank said slowly, "and a back room, and you disappearing." Dean closed his eyes again, once, brief and controlled. "You always noticed more than you let on." Frank felt a flicker of unease. "You left in the middle of the set. You didn't come back until morning." Dean nodded. "I never told you why." Frank shifted in his chair, the faintest creak of wood under him suddenly too loud. "I figured you had your reasons." Dean opened his eyes. "I had my consequences." The air changed. "There was a call," Dean said. "One of those calls a man doesn't forget because he feels it before he understands it. A voice telling him something has already happened. Something he cannot fix. Something he cannot sing over." Frank's hand tightened on the brim of the hat he still held, though he did not remember keeping it there. "My boy was sick," Dean continued. And the words were simple, but they did not sound simple. Not the kind of sick people talk about. Not the kind you make plans around. The kind that rearranges everything in your chest. Frank's breath slowed. He had known about Dean's family. He had known about struggles. But this was not history. This was something else. "I went to the hospital that night," Dean said. "I stood in a hallway that smelled like clean and fear and watched doctors walk past me like I was furniture. And I remember thinking, this is where all the noise ends. This is where the jokes don't fit." He paused. The machine spoke quietly. "I stood there for hours," he said. "Long enough for the sun to start thinking about coming back. And I realized something I had never admitted before. I didn't know how to be there. Not as a star. Not as a voice. Just as a man. I didn't know what to do with my hands. I didn't know how to pray. I didn't know what to promise. Frank's eyes burned, though he did not blink. You never told me. Dean looked at him then, and something ancient moved through his expression. Because I didn't want to be the sad story. I didn't want to be the quiet one. I didn't want you to look at me and see what I couldn't fix. Frank swallowed. He had spent his life wanting to fix things, to lift people, to hold rooms together with melody and force of will. The idea that Dean had stood in a place where none of that worked unsettled him more than he expected. So I went back to work, Dean said. Not that night, but the next, and the next, and the next. And every time someone laughed, it felt like stealing. Every time they clapped, it felt like I had fooled them into thinking I was whole. Frank leaned forward now, his voice low. You didn't fool me. Dean's gaze softened. You didn't look close. The words were not accusation. They were truth. Frank opened his mouth, then closed it again. He thought of the years, the stages, the arguments, the reconciliations, the late-night talks that had always curved around something, but never quite touched it. He thought of how often he had chosen rhythm over stillness, momentum over depth, laughter over the harder work of listening. I didn't want to burden you, Dean said. You were carrying your own weather. I knew that. But there's a difference between protecting a friend and hiding from him, and I crossed that line more times than I can count. Dean shifted slightly, breathing a little heavier now, but still steady. There are things a man can outgrow, he said. Fame, habits, even regret. But there are things he just carries, quietly, so they don't leak into the world and stain it. Frank shook his head faintly. You didn't have to carry them alone. Dean's eyes glistened, but he did not look away. No, but I did. Silence spread between them, not empty, but full. Frank felt it pressing on his chest, heavy with everything that could have been said sooner. He realized with a sudden, piercing clarity that time had not taken Dean's strength. It had stripped away everything that distracted from it. I've had a lot of nights in this room, Dean went on. Nights where the lights are off and the machines sound louder than they should. Nights where the only thing left to do is count what mattered. And what didn't. Frank waited. I keep coming back to the same thought, Dean said. Not the stages. Not the applause. Not the photographs. I come back to the moments I chose noise instead of honesty. And the people I loved enough to be honest with. And wasn't. Frank's chest tightened. You're here now, Frank said. Dean nodded slowly. That's why I asked for you. Frank lifted his eyes fully to him. You didn't have to ask. Dean's voice softened further. Yes, I did. Another pause. The light shifted again. Catching the thin lines in Dean's face, the familiar curve of his mouth, the unmistakable presence of a man who had lived loudly and was now preparing to speak quietly. He looked at Frank not like a partner, not like a fellow star, not like a brother of stages, but like someone standing at the edge of a long-held truth. There's something I never said. Dean murmured. Frank felt his pulse move into his throat. And I don't have much time left to keep it quiet. Frank leaned closer, every instinct sharpening. What is it? He asked. Dean's lips parted, breath shallow, but steady. And for a brief, suspended moment, the world seemed to draw inward around them, as if the room itself understood that whatever came next would not belong to memory or rumor, but to something that would live in Frank Sinatra long after this bed was empty. And Dean Martin began to speak. Dean did not speak right away. He drew in a slow breath, the kind that seems to travel farther than the lungs, as though it were gathering air from memory itself. Frank watched his chest rise and fall, and for the first time since entering the room, he felt fear that it had nothing to do with machines or doctors or the measured language of illness. This fear was older. This fear was the kind that arrives when you sense a truth is about to move from one person into another, and that once it does, neither of you will be the same again. I spent a long time, Dean said quietly, believing that strength meant keeping the show going. Frank did not interrupt. I believed that if I could still walk on stage, still make people laugh, still hit the note, then whatever was breaking behind the curtain didn't count. that it was private, contained, mine to manage. But there's a difference between privacy and isolation, and I built my life on confusing the two. His eyes drifted briefly toward the window, where the pale afternoon light clung to the edge of the glass as if unsure whether to leave or stay. When my boy was sick, I told myself I was protecting everyone. I told myself I was protecting him. I told myself I was protecting you. The truth is, I was protecting the version of myself I didn't want to lose. Frank's jaw tightened slightly. Which version? Dean looked back at him. The one who could still walk into a room and not feel afraid. The words landed quietly, but Frank felt them like weight settling. There were nights, Dean continued, when I would leave the hospital and drive nowhere, just circles, empty streets, radio off. I didn't want to go home because home meant waiting. I didn't want to go back to the club because that meant pretending. So I drove, and somewhere in those miles, something in me changed. Not loudly, not all at once. Just enough that I started carrying a question I didn't know how to ask. Frank's fingers tightened around the hat brim again. What question? Dean's mouth curved faintly, but there was sadness in it. Who am I if the voice doesn't fix it? The machines whispered. The hallway hummed. I realized, Dean said, that everything people loved about me was something I did, not something I was. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure the doing would be enough. Frank leaned closer, his voice low. It would have been enough for me. Dean held his gaze. You say that now? Frank's brow furrowed. I didn't give you the chance then, Dean said. And that's part of what I came to understand in this room. Regret isn't always about what we did wrong. Sometimes it's about the good we never let happen. Frank's throat tightened. He wanted to protest, to reach for reassurance, but something in Dean's tone stopped him. This was not about comfort. This was about accuracy. There was a night, Dean went on, years after Chicago. We were in Vegas. Big crowd. Big laughs. Big lights. You remember it, Frank nodded faintly. You closed the show. I almost didn't go on, Dean said. I was sitting alone, staring at my hands, thinking about a conversation I'd had that morning with a doctor. One of those conversations where a man nods, because that's what men do when the words are too heavy to carry out loud. He swallowed gently. I thought about calling you. I even picked up the phone, and then I put it down. Frank's voice was barely audible. Why? Dean met his eyes. Because I didn't want you to hear me not know what to say. The sentence moved through Frank slowly, as if it needed time to find a place to land. I walked on stage instead, Dean said. And you were standing there? And you smiled at me. And the band came in. And the room rose. And in that moment, I realized something that scared me more than any diagnosis ever had. Frank waited. I realized I could hide inside the act forever, Dean said, and nobody would ever pull me out unless I asked. Silence deepened, and I didn't ask. Frank looked at him, the years rearranging themselves in his mind. The jokes, the quick saves, the moments he had thought were camaraderie and now saw might also have been cover. He felt, with a sharpness that surprised him, how often he himself had used Dean's laughter to avoid his own quieter rooms. I wasn't just protecting myself, Dean said. I was protecting you too, because you were the one person who would have noticed if I stopped pretending. And I wasn't ready to see that look in your eyes. What look? The one you're wearing now. Frank did not answer. He couldn't. Something had begun to press behind his eyes. Not tears yet, but the unmistakable preparation for them. There's something else, Dean said softly. Frank's breath slowed. Go on. Dean's voice lowered further, not in volume, but in intimacy. The night my boy finally turned a corner. The night the doctors said the word stable, like they were afraid it might hear them and change its mind. I walked outside the hospital and I sat on the curb like I was 20 again, just breathing air like it was new. And I realized I had survived something I never thought I would. Frank listened, unmoving, and in that relief, Dean said, came something I wasn't prepared for. Guilt. Not about the sickness. About the silence. He turned his head slightly on the pillow. I had lived through the hardest season of my life. Without letting my closest friend inside it, Frank shook his head faintly. You don't know, yes, Dean said gently. I do. Not because you demanded it. Because love does. The word did not feel dramatic. It felt precise. I told myself I would fix it later, Dean went on. That I would sit you down someday and explain the man behind the smile. But later is a very convincing place. It makes promises time never signs. Frank felt something inside him loosen and ache at the same time. He thought of all the later conversations he himself had postponed. All the emotional accounts he had assumed would always remain open. There is a version of our friendship, Dean said, that only lived on stages. And there is another one that never quite got to breathe. Frank's voice finally broke the silence. It can still breathe. Dean studied him, and for a moment, the room felt suspended between what was and what might still be allowed to be. That's why I asked you here, Dean said. Frank leaned in closer, now only inches away. Then tell me. Dean's eyes glistened, but he did not look away. There is something, he said, I never told anyone. Not about the sickness. Not about the fear. Not about the nights. Frank's heart moved hard against his ribs. It's about you. The words struck deeper than Frank expected. For a long time, Dean said, I told myself our friendship was built on music and timing and shared madness, and it was. But it was built on something else, too. Something I didn't have language for back then, Frank whispered. What? Dean's breath trembled just slightly. The reason I never let you see me fall, he said, is because you were the one person whose disappointment I wouldn't have survived. Frank felt his vision blur before he realized his eyes had filled, and the reason, Dean continued, I never told you that, is because it would have meant admitting how much you actually meant to me when the lights were off. The machines continued their gentle counting. The city continued not knowing. Frank Sinatra sat very still, realizing that what Dean was offering him now was not nostalgia, not apology, not memory, but something rarer and heavier. Truth, and somewhere deep in Frank's chest. Something he had carried for decades without naming it began to answer back. Dean drew in a shallow breath, gathering the rest of what he had saved. There's one more thing, he said. Frank leaned closer, his voice barely a sound. I'm here. Dean's lips parted, and the final line of his confession waited just behind them. The room felt smaller now, not because its walls had moved, but because everything unnecessary had quietly left it. The light beyond the window had softened into a pale, late-day glow, the kind that carries the feeling of endings without announcing them. The machines continued their steady language, but even they seemed to speak more gently, as though some instinct had warned them that this was not a moment to interrupt. Frank had moved closer without realizing it, his chair angled inward, his body unconsciously guarding the space between them. As if whatever Dean was about to say needed protection from the air, Dean lay still, breathing shallow but steady, eyes open, present. Fixed on Frank's face, with an attention that carried more life than any stage he had ever stood on. He did not rush. He had rushed enough in his lifetime. This was not something that could be delivered like a line. It was something that had to arrive the way certain memories do, slowly, with weight, with permission. For years, Dean said quietly, I thought legacy was what stayed behind when a man left the room. The records, the photographs, the jokes people repeated when they wanted to feel younger. I thought that's what mattered, what endured. But these nights in this bed, they corrected me. Frank did not speak. He was afraid that if he did, something fragile might retreat. Nothing you leave behind, Dean continued, matters as much as what you leave inside the people who knew you when no one else was looking. His gaze did not waver. And there's something I need you to carry. Because I won't. Frank's chest tightened. Whatever it is, Dean drew in a careful breath. The kind a man takes when he knows there will not be many more to waste. There is a moment, he said, that never left me. A small one. You wouldn't remember it. We were young, not famous yet, We had just finished a set in a place that didn't even have a sign out front. You were frustrated. Someone had said something about your voice. Something careless. Something small. But it hit you wrong. You sat outside by yourself, staring at the pavement like it had personally offended you. Frank's eyes flickered with recognition. He had forgotten that night. Or thought he had. I came out with 2 coffees, Dean said. You didn't take yours. You just said, maybe this isn't enough. Maybe I'm not. Frank felt a faint ache move through him. I didn't know what to say, Dean went on. So I did what I always did. I made a joke. You smiled. But it didn't touch the thing underneath. And later that night, after we split up, I went back and sat where you'd been sitting. And I realized something that followed me longer than any applause. Frank's breath was shallow now. What? That I had believed in you before I believed in myself, Dean said. The sentence did not sound dramatic. It sounded settled. Like something that had finally found its right place. I built a lot of confidence on laughter, Dean said. But the first real certainty I ever had was about you. Frank's vision blurred. And that's what I never told you, Dean continued. Not because it was complicated, because it was simple. And simple truths are the easiest to postpone. Dean's breathing changed slightly, not in struggle, but in texture, as if his body knew it was approaching the edge of something long held. I watched you carry rooms, he said. I watched you carry people. I watched you carry pain and turn it into something others could stand under. And somewhere along the way, I let myself believe that meant you didn't need to be carried too. Frank shook his head faintly. I always did. I know, Dean said gently. Now, silence returned, heavier, fuller. Dean's eyes glistened, but his voice did not falter. All those years, I didn't let you see me afraid. I thought I was sparing you. The truth is, I was stealing something from both of us. I was stealing you the chance to be my friend, and I was stealing myself the chance to need one. Frank's lips parted, but no sound came. So here's what I need you to know, Dean said. Not as a performer. Not as the man people think they know. As the person who sat beside you when neither of us had anything to lose yet. Frank leaned closer, until the space between them was measured in breath. Dean's voice lowered into something almost private. Something that felt less like speech and more like offering. I was never the strong one, he whispered. I was the loud one. You were the brave one. You walked into rooms and felt everything and still stayed. I hid behind timing. You stood inside truth. Frank felt the first tear escape before he realized he was crying, and the reason, Dean murmured, I couldn't bear the thought of disappointing you, is because you were the only person I never performed for. Frank closed his eyes, his head bowing slightly, shoulders lifting once, a quiet, involuntary motion he could not stop. Dean watched him, something like relief softening his face. Then he spoke the words he had saved. Frank, he whispered, if there is anything of me that deserves to last, let it be this. Frank lifted his head. Dean's voice was barely sound now, but every syllable carried. Tell people I loved them, even when I didn't know how to show it. The sentence moved through Frank like a wave through a shore that had never been empty. And tell yourself, Dean added, that you were enough. Long before anyone clapped, Frank's breath broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. In the quiet way something breaks when it has been holding too much for too long. He reached out, placing his hand over Dean's, his forehead lowering until it nearly touched their joined hands. His voice finally finding its way through the weight in his chest. You should have told me sooner. Dean's lips curved faintly. I'm telling you now. They stayed like that for a long moment. 2 men, no audience, no lights, no history left to manage. Only presence. When Frank finally looked up again, Dean's eyes were closed. His breathing remained shallow but calm, not gone. Just resting? Frank did not speak again. He did not need to, because something had already been placed inside him. And years later, when people spoke about Dean Martin, they would talk about songs and laughter and a voice that seemed to belong to a more generous era. But Frank Sinatra would remember something else. A quiet room, a hand in his. A whisper that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with truth. And he would understand. For the rest of his life that the greatest thing a man leaves behind is not what the world applauds, but what he finally has the courage to give away